Hello everyone. I'm MJ Albanna, and I'm hosting this event with Stephanie Webster and Suresh Ghalsasi. We're all executive MBA students at the London Business School, and today we have the first of what will become a regular series of Facul-Tea events during which we will have faculty members from different departments. Today we have four distinguished professors from the Department of OB, Dan Cable, Kathleen O'Connor, Randall Peterson, and Nero Sivanathan. Before I start, I'd like to thank the faculty for taking the time to be with us and the audience for dialing in and submitting your questions. We have over 500 registered for the event, and it seems that the topic has struck a chord since over 400 of you submitted questions. And you can see how many are attending now. And by looking at the questions, we could see that they could be broken into different themes. And we'll try and cover these themes as we go along. Firstly, let me start off by asking Professor Nero, how do experts define confidence, overconfidence, and underconfidence?
Sure. Thanks, MJ. Thanks for having me on this. It's great to be connected both to the alumni as well as the current students. Some of you, I gather, I will see at some point in my negotiations class. So overconfidence obviously is classified as a bias, right? So this is in sort of the battery of biases that you would have heard of, sort of the names of Kahneman, Tversky, who for 25, 30 years kind of systematically uncovered, if you will, the whole host of biases that we fall victim to in our pursuit to make sort of sound, rational judgments. And overconfidence is one which is really sort of a miscalibration between sort of one's subjective confidence and sort of the objective data that exists. And that miscalibration is systematic in that it's positively biased rather than negatively, and hence referred to as overconfidence. There's about 15 plus years of research on this. I'm happy to send you the sites if you suffer from insomnia. It's a wonderful read. I would highly urge you to read some of these papers. But broadly, this stuff, the overconfidence bias kind of further breaks down into sort of three clusters. And the first one is sort of overestimation, right? So this is where you evaluate your ability on certain dimensions higher than one should objectively do so, right? So an example of this form of bias is something called illusion of control. This is where you believe you have greater control over outcomes than you actually do, right? So I'll give you a classic example of this. So in some studies, what they do is they bring people in and ask them to guess the number of a six-sided die, right? If there's a die roll, if you guess the number and the die roll matches your guess, you get, let's say, $10, 10 pounds. And then they ask them, would you like to experiment to roll the die, or would you like to roll the die? And not surprisingly, everyone says, I would like to roll the die, right? Despite the fact that it's a random event, somehow you feel that you controlling the die roll somehow has some sort of predictive validity. The other cluster is this idea of over-precision. This is perhaps the most academic of these biases, which is the degree to which you show confidence in sort of your knowledge base, right? So the typical way they test this is they ask you a bunch of general knowledge questions and ask you to give you a 90% confidence interval, right? So you could be asked, at what age did Mozart die? Can you give me an interval within which you're 90% sure that that's the correct answer? And so if people are calibrated, 90 out of 100 questions you should get right, 10 of them you should get wrong. On average, people get 50. In case, I know Dan's wondering when Mozart died, it's 35, Dan. He's rather young. So there's a bunch of these items. So one of them, I think, is the gestation period for an elephant, which is quite long. I don't remember the number, but
18 months, Nero. It's 18 months.
Oh, look, I am glad you are on my team, Dan. Look at you. Gestation period of an elephant. This is good. This is, I've been told that we're in teams. So Dan's my tag team partner. So all those countless years wasted watching WWF is going to pay off now, all in this 90-minute call. And the last one, I think that's the one where most of you are probably considering, or many of the questions sort of center around, is this idea whereby you show a level of confidence or sort of overplacement of yourself relative to others, right? This is where you get this better than average effect, right? So the famous example is when you ask people, are you better than an average driver? 93% say yes, right? Which is sort of a statistical anomaly, or people believe their likelihood of going to heaven is greater than Mother Teresa, right? And so, so people rate themselves as better at everything from politeness to driving ability. The irony of all of this is people also rate themselves to be better than others in terms of humbleness, right? So with the irony sort of being lost on the very people filling out those surveys. So those, if you will, MJ, broadly, if I were to kind of give you both sort of the research side of sort of how overconfidence is both kind of thought through, studied. One of our colleagues that, Dan Randall and Kathleen are aware of, Don Moore, who's at Berkeley, has been studying this for, I don't know, at least a dozen, if not 15 plus years. And so it gets broken into sort of smaller grains of confidence, but those are broadly kind of the three streams.
Okay. So, Kathleen, I was wondering, would you say that there is a quantitative scale upon which one can measure up their confidence?
Yes, there is. I'm gonna depart a little bit. So Nero was talking about confidence in the area of decision making, right? So how confident are we when we make a decision? So he's talking about prospect theory and Kahneman and Tversky. I'm gonna kind of step to the side a little bit and talk about another way of thinking about confidence, which is called self-efficacy. So self-efficacy, I've done a little bit of research in this area. So self-efficacy is really about the belief you have that you have the skills or temperament or ability to be successful on some very specific and particular task, right? So you might say, we use these words, highly self-efficacious when it comes to running a marathon, but I have low self-efficacy when it comes to swimming 2 miles across the lake, right? So for very specific tasks, we feel more or less confident. We call that efficacy, and it has to do with whether we think that we have the skills to do that task well. So it's a way of thinking about it. So that can definitely be measured. In our lab years ago, we measured it for, say, negotiation. And we found that some people, how efficacious, how high people's self-efficacy was for negotiation was an enormous predictor of how well they did in the negotiation. And in fact, other scholars went on to find in meta-analyses that it was extremely powerful in predicting how well people negotiated. So absolutely, self-efficacy can absolutely be measured. And you can look at sort of 10-item scales, and you can sort of rate yourself for any particular task. Again, think about your own life. How efficacious are you about baking a cake or giving a presentation or running a set of complicated data analyses, right? It varies. It's not a factor necessarily of just the person. It's about the context.
But we don't see this used very often. And sometimes people say, you might be fooled by appearances, and, someone puts a show on and we fall for it.
Oh yeah, that to me is a little bit less about confidence, a little less about self-efficacy and more about confidence. I'll say one thing about that, if I may, and then I'll turn to somebody else. Yeah, absolutely. I think confidence is very powerful, right? When someone strides onto the stage and they look, what does confidence look like? It looks like they're in control. They're not sweating particularly. They're making relaxed eye contact. Their eyes aren't flicking on and flicking away. You know what I think, and I don't have it, I'll turn it over to my colleagues in a moment, but that makes people feel comfortable, right? Emotions are contagious. So when someone's on stage looking nervous, that makes us look nervous. When someone's on stage looking confident, that makes us feel a bit more relaxed. And so there is real benefit in having someone do that. Whether they actually know what the hell they're talking about, I think, is a completely different story. I mean, those don't have to be aligned in any particular way. But we know it's convincing. We know showing up to the meeting, looking like you know what you're talking about, and speaking as though you do, you're going to be influential in the meeting. So yeah, that's absolutely true.
Okay. One last question from me, Stephanie, and then you can take over. Professor Cable, who's best suited in assessing someone's confidence? Many people have asked, should I be judging myself, or should I have someone externally tell me whether I'm confident enough, overconfident, and so forth?
Okay, great. A couple of thoughts about that. What Kathleen and to some extent Nero were getting at has to do with how you would assess yourself. And I think that is an important place to start. And I think that a lot of times that has to do with practice, frankly, especially if you're kind of wading into some domain where you just haven't tried it before. It can just feel awkward. And if you assessed yourself, my guess is it would probably come off as you feel childish, or you feel awkward, or maybe even you feel like I'm better than this. And so that feeling, certainly has merit, and it usually can be read by the people around you. And as Kathleen just said, it can decrease their confidence in you. That doesn't mean, though, that we don't try new things. It's the only way to kind of get the confidence is to work your way into it. So when we bring up concepts that I know everybody on the call has probably heard of, but like growth mindset, the growth mindset would start with the idea that you accept that in life, everything's hard before it gets easy, and know that we have to work our way into the confidence and so on. I liked how you brought up the asking people around you. I mean, in some way, shape, or form, this could even be done with like peer coaches. Let's say that you have trouble speaking up in meetings, for example, and you worry about how you come across. You might team up with somebody else that is trying to work on some trait and give each other feedback after meetings. I think that would be a low cost and also low stress way of getting the feedback. So I like that a lot. And then I think the other thing that I would think about or talk about is if we're on some performance dimensions, like, I don't know, take an easy one, like sales or something like this, it might be important to go with somebody who is more experienced with either the type of the product or the type of selling at first, because you can't watch the room and manage your internal emotions and actually present the facts. You can't get it all. And so the idea of having somebody that's diligently looking out for how you're doing, then giving you feedback, that may not improve your self-confidence at the beginning, but it would help you practice your way into it. MJ, did I cover what you wanted there? I'm sorry.
Yes. Yes. That was good. Stephanie, to you.
Thank you very much for that. And this one is for Professor Randall. And for those of you who haven't had the pleasure of being taught by Professor Randall, I will include his bio later, as I will include all of the different biographies of all four professors. So Professor Randall, this is more about cultural differences in confidence. So certain cultures are deemed more confident than others. If we come from a country that displays a lot of confidence externally, are we supposed to modify our behavior when we go into another culture? And just talking about cultural differences when it comes to confidence in general.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'll talk about a couple different things we haven't talked about yet. One is that, as you rightly highlight, culture makes a big difference. So things like power distance values, cultures where there are strongest difference between leaders and followers, and there's meant to be a high status difference. We're not comfortable if there's not. Obviously, that becomes more important than for communicating your confidence to be successful in the role. There's also, the other thing we haven't talked about yet is there's all kinds of indicators outside of even culture about how confident we should present in a particular moment. Men are meant to be more confident than women in the world of work. That's the stereotype. Now, that stereotype isn't helpful. It can be quite dysfunctional and unhelpful. And it shows up in personality. So those who are more dominant tend to be more about a lot of things. Nero did a great study, what are our expectations of leaders? Where if we feel threatened in some way, we want leaders even more confident. In fact, we'll pick confidence over competence, right? Something's better than nothing seems to be what happens when people get really scared. These are all different things. So it's not like there's one perfect way, one perfect level of confidence. Confidence is really determined by lots of different things. And we probably, to be most successful, need to be more or less confident in different situations.
Yeah, and those different situations can be, for example, when you have a non-English native speaker suddenly finding themselves in a place surrounded with English speakers, very fluent. So they could be confident before, and then they come into a situation where they suddenly feel underconfident. So how, just focusing on culture alone, culture could also mean not just simply countries, but different company cultures when there's shifts there.
Yes, obviously there are big country, as you say, company differences in how much confidence one is expected to project in a given moment on a given topic. So I don't know if any, I'm trying to think. Don't know what else I can add to that, but
that's okay. We'll come back. I liked your points on gender, and we're going to cover gender in a moment. And I want to understand more about the male-female differences there. But on to Nero. There was a lot of talk about your research in this area, but in your experience from being a professor and teaching and seeing people improve their confidence as you're teaching, and how do you respond to different confidence levels in your class? And how do you bring everybody up to a level so that everybody feels safe to be a confident version of themselves?
Yeah, so I think the prescriptive kind of advice around confidence is kind of very sparse. It's very difficult to sort of find a unified sort of idea of sort of what works for one may not work for other. And I think Randall sort of briefly covered this. I think so. I'll give you one example. I know we'll certainly cover gender difference in confidence, and I think that has a profound impact. And we spend a lot of time talking about it in negotiations. I think some of those differences are obviously we're brought up in sort of a social structure. And so Randall talked about stereotypes. It's both stereotypes people hold for others, but also people also then subscribe to those stereotypes, or then they, what sometimes called sort of stereotype threat, you end up sort of conforming to those stereotypes. So there's this idea of sort of like women don't ask in negotiation, right? This is kind of this sort of key element that has all sorts of profound impact in wage differences, et cetera, of just simply individuals not triggering to negotiate. And it has nothing to do with skill set, right? So especially after a 10-week course on negotiations, one of the things that I urge individuals is you certainly have the skills just as well as the men in the room to negotiate, but it's sort of bringing yourself to negotiate. And there's an entire sort of mental exercise. Dan talked a little bit about sort of the growth mindset, or sort of and various bits that you could do prior to negotiating. But one of the things I used to do in my negotiations class is for one of the assignments, I used to say, if you want to get an extension, you simply email me and I'm happy to give you that extension. And this was really kind of a experiment I did in the class, partly motivated by someone who asked, does this sort of play out in other contexts? And I did this for 3 terms, I think. I think I had 12 men email me and ask for an extension and 1 female, right? And I don't think there was any sort of differences in who needed it, but it was just simply asking for it. Then, of course, you can imagine has knock-on consequences. So one of the things I just sort of did was...
What percentage of your class was male and what percentage was female?
I don't remember the exact numbers, but it would be comparable to the typical MBA population. So it would just be sort of a microcosm that was...
There's less women anyway.
Yeah, there is. Yeah. But even sort of controlling for sort of proportion, it was significantly less. Again, I didn't do a proper study. But again, so there kind of the solution was kind of structural, just to give it to everyone, but give that extension, because it got rather depressing to see sort of the more confident males asking for it. And there's an entire literature around sort of even triggering that negotiation ends up being an issue of confidence, not sort of ability. So I'm not sure I'm giving you necessarily a right answer, and the reason, or one single answer, is I think it varies as a function of sort of the different contexts, and Kathleen talked about sort of self-efficacy, and so that could be one route by which you increase people's efficacy, and there's various sort of mechanisms and avenues to do that, or self-esteem. I went with sort of a structural solution, but which of course then also helps people's confidence. It's one step removed, but yeah, that was a solution in a domain that obviously I was teaching in.
Well, maybe the males that you described were externally confident as a front, and we're going to be talking about faking it until you're making it later. But inside they weren't that confident at all. But I think there's something to be said for at least displaying confidence.
But maybe males are just lazier and leave things to the end, and then they find themselves in trouble, and hence they have to ask for an extension.
And on the topic of mass generalizations,
that is a lot of assumptions.
let's get some research from Kathleen's end to bring some clarity to this madness. So on the topic of gender, you've done extraordinary research in this field. The confidence between the genders, whether women should smile or not, that was the most insightful in one of our lessons. That I'll let you talk about the differences in gender.
So I'll say a little bit. I'll say a little bit about it. I'm sure even the men have something to say about this. It doesn't take a woman to to do the research or even care about it. So I'll leave some to the men as well. I know Randall has some things to say. I'm going to take a little. Can I take a little bit of a turn around this one, and I'll leave them to some of it. I think that some of what Nero talks about in the negotiation, absolutely, women sometimes don't ask, and it could be that they lack confidence for doing it. I don't think there's any argument about that. I think they also sometimes are just rational. They've learned that when they ask for things, they sometimes suffer worse consequences because they're not supposed to be asking for things. That's something that men are supposed to do. So I think that there's some of it is, but it's also the confidence. I saw some of the questions beforehand. You guys shared them with me, which is really helpful. And one stuck out for me. And that was this idea that some of the women were feeling like they couldn't express their confidence, or they were being asked to be confident in ways that felt like, sure, that works for men, but can it really work for women? And if I can say something about that, two things. The first is lots of us men and women, particularly early on in our careers, particularly the younger we are, feel underconfident. The imposter syndrome is not limited to women. It's not limited to other people. I'm not going to put my colleagues Randall and Nero and Dan on the spot, but I taught my first class when I was 23 years old, and I certainly lacked confidence and of course experience and wisdom. I mean, I lacked a lot of things, and confidence is just one of them. So you learn that, and this is to Dan's point about practicing, right? This is about practicing, and this is for both men and women. I had a colleague, getting to the question you asked earlier, I had a colleague who would say to people who came to him, and this is particularly women, as a matter of fact, that's all tied to gender, I want to speak up more in class, but I can't seem to find the right moment to do it. I lack the confidence to do it. And he would say, set your alarm on your phone, silent to vibrate. And every 15 minutes it goes off, you have to put your hand up and ask a question. And it was about, don't wait until you feel confident to do the thing you need to do. You're going to practice it first, and then confidence will follow. And so I do say this a lot to women. Yes, there's a different repertoire of tactics. We're a little bit more constrained in what we can and can't do. There are issues around competence and likability, absolutely true. But some of it is just you have to practice it. And we've not had as much experience practicing, asking for things, negotiating for things. We haven't been socialized, many of us women, especially depending on where you live in the world. So we haven't been doing it since we were 12 years old. And so it feels really risky to do it when that stakes are a little bit higher. So I go to Dan's point, practice it. It's about, if I'm afraid to do it, I do it anyway. And that's what courage is. And so if you're afraid to speak out, sometimes it's saying, I'm gonna do it twice in every meeting. I'm gonna have something to say, even if I have nothing, because that never stopped the guy down the table from me, right? Not having something insightful to say doesn't stop half the people in this room from speaking, right? So don't let it stop you, right? So I'll stop there, but there's a lot more to say to women, but that's just something that I would urge you. Don't wait till you feel confident to do it to build the confidence.
Thank you so much for that, Kathleen. And I'd like to go to Professor Randall now. And then after that, MJ, if you would like to see what Professor Cable has to say, because I'm sure he's on the edge of his seat on this one. So Professor Randall, over to you. Gender, how does that affect confidence? What should each gender learn from each other?
I'm not sure where to start here. Yes.
Over the years, you would have taught many males, many females, and you've seen different confidence levels across the genders. Have you noticed anything in particular, either from your own personal experience or from the research that you would have perused, around how gender and confidence interplay?
Yeah, I mean, there's a million things to say. I'm trying to figure out which is going to be most helpful here.
Let's start one at a time. So if there's a million, we've got to get going.
Yeah, we got to get going. All right. So one of the topics to talk about is just how people, classify women, right? A couple of our colleagues do this work. So women can either be competent or, friendly and warm. And men can be both, but women are meant to be one or the other. That's one of the strong stereotypes. So if I'm confident, I've now been told I'm not nice, your whole life. And, that sticks. Right now I'm supposed to, I was a good girl, and now I need to be a confident woman. Okay, that's a major change. And, as Kathleen says, and Dan talked about, it's trialing, it's getting out there. Don't wait to feel it before you actually do it. Don't wait to be asked. You've got to push yourself out there if that's what you're feeling. And yeah, fake it before you make it. There's a saying because there's some truth to it. Encourage, as Kathleen said, is really about, it's not about not feeling scared to do it or not feeling, some degree of threat in doing it. It's what you do it when you're actually feeling that stuff. You still put your hand up and you still do it. And the more you do it, the more you think, actually, I am the kind of person who would do that or who could do that. Barring some horrific experience, which is probably unlikely anyway. And the other thing that we haven't talked about, of course, and it relates to the earlier topic about culture and leadership, which is when you're trialing and experimenting, the role of the leader is hugely important. When leaders shut you people down, then of course everybody learns very quickly not really to talk or to ask questions. And if that's one you choose to start experimenting in, it can, it can be damaging to you, whereas the next person who's used to asking a lot of questions and being confident, they rightly make the attribution to the leader. But when you're experimenting, so it's also about, I want to experiment, and hopefully you'll find the place to experiment with the right professor, with the right leader who's happy and open to be, to have that going on and to support that in whatever environment that you're in.
Actually, that's true. The professors have a huge impact on how confident or underconfident students feel. So, MJ, maybe you want to pick up that and more.
Sure. If I could just briefly add to that, what Kathleen and Randall said about sort of just simply kind of just speaking up. So one of the areas I do work is on sort of status and power, and there's something to be said about sort of the feedback loop, right? So we know that just those who speak up more are afforded greater status and are given greater credibility and various other positive elements. And the benefit of also that is that the next time you speak up, you're viewed through that lens of that credibility or that status. So you're afforded even more status. So it actually becomes easier. And so it's almost getting out of that negative feedback loop to the positive one. And so sort of Kathleen, to Randall's comment that just getting people, you don't need to be 100%, but it's sort of taking that first step sets in motion the likelihood that it actually becomes easier the second time and third time, partly because you're more confident, but it's also the audience gives you credibility. And that's, sadly kind of how status is divided within groups.
Professor Cable, again, on the subject of gender, and then I'll move on to another. I'll just give you the chance to, if you have anything to add to that.
I do. One of the things that seems so damaging about stereotype threat and this idea that a lot of times women are expected to act in a certain way and they know that, and then they are feeling a lot of threat around disproving what people are falsely assuming about them. I wanted to mention there's this whole research literature in the self-affirmation domain. And I wanted to bring it up because I've been doing some firsthand research on it right now. And self-affirmation is basically allowing people to remember and reflect on what they're best at. And that might be because of unique skill sets or backgrounds. It might be because of unique values they have. But it seems to work reliably. It works in particular for people that are feeling threatened. So people that might be feeling imposter syndrome. It might be feeling like they're a fish out of water. Maybe even what we talked about earlier, if it feels like you just haven't practiced it well enough. So one of the things that we've been working on that's in 2 different studies, it seems like it's working, is, and this may sound really strange to you all, especially culturally, there may be a huge rift here, but this is what we're doing. We're going out to people. You know what a 360 is. We're going out to people and we're getting family members and friends and work colleagues from the past and mentors. And we're having each of those people do a sort of a 360, like an interpersonal 360, where each of those people writes a story about a time you've seen that person at their best. So what this person ends up getting is a sort of a living eulogy where they're getting 20 or 30 perspectives on what they're really good at. And then they can go off and they can read that and look for themes and kind of parse it down to what are the things that seem to come up again and again about what I am excellent at, what I'm exceptional at, essentially. And then that could be something that you could start using to build a certain confidence, maybe before an interview, maybe before a big talk, or maybe before a presentation, a sales talk, whatever it might be. But it's this idea about remembering that there are things that you're really good at doing. And while you may feel uncertain or even like an imposter, if you reflect on the natural strengths that you have, it seems to really open you up. And so in the 2 studies we looked at, what we did is we gave these to teams that had to solve real problems and randomly assigned half the people to get one of these reports before the exercise and half before, at the end. And the ones that got it beforehand were more willing and ready to submit unique ideas and like perspectives that would be unique to them and kind of give more to the group. So I don't know if that's a proxy for confidence or not, but it definitely helped them speak up and add more value. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that into the mix as like an application that you could try if you don't think it's too weird.
That's good. So I'm going to stay with you, Professor Cable, and say, so working with people who are better than I can stimulate growth. Now, how does one not succumb to relative deprivation? And for those who don't know relative deprivation, let's take an example of someone with an IQ of 180. So this guy is a genius, but he would feel like he's relatively deprived or relatively stupid when working with people who have an IQ of 200. So going back to the question, how does one not fall prey to self-doubt when working with a group of highly confident individuals?
Oh, that's great. Well, I don't want to just repeat everything I just said, but it is relevant. It is relevant to remember that lots of us have different strengths. And rather than falling into the trap of comparing yourself on the one dimension that person may flourish in, it might be interesting to think about complementarity and what you bring to the party that maybe they wouldn't be able to or even want to bring. And again, it takes some reflection to get to that. The idea, it's not normal for us. I want to reiterate that. I know that there's a lot of emphasis in the world on not being arrogant and not being narcissistic. And I totally understand that and believe in that. But there also is a value to being honest and reflective about what you do bring that's unique and that's valuable. So I think that some of the same answer there applies. I also think that there's an idea, this is not going to be a research-backed one, but I like it a lot. It's this idea that you have to play your own game. And I think that if you try to judge yourself by everybody's rules and everybody else's approach, you're going to come up short usually. You're at best playing catch up to what they're already good at. So I think at the very beginning, before I think we even got started, somebody was talking about how you have to have a confidence in your unique ability and just put it out there. And it doesn't mean that you're always going to be on the same dimension beating people. It's more that you're complementing something to the package. So that's an idea.